Hello, everyone. My name is John Sierra, and I'm a Tolkien scholar. And what that essentially means is that I'm the type of guy that you can come to with any sort of question about the works of J.R.R. Tolkien, and I'll get back to you with a well-reasoned, well-researched, and hopefully informative and comprehensible, I guess I should say, answer. I've been studying the works of Tolkien for many decades, and I have been doing this YouTube show here for over 125 episodes now. We're on episode 126, and I'm very happy to do it. And this is where I say to subscribe to the channel, and I'll ask you again at the end of the video, but I'll ask you twice. I'll ask you at the beginning and at the end. The beginning, because all YouTubers do that, right? They start off, hey, everybody, how's it going? Subscribe. And, which I think is a little presumptuous, but I'll go along, when in Gondor, you do as the Gondorians do. But at the end of the video, then I'll say, well, now you've watched the whole thing, and now you know you want to subscribe. So anyway, and of course I'm presuming you're going to make it all the way to the end. You might get 10 minutes and go, this guy is an insufferable nerd, I can't take it. But anyway, we have 10 questions to get through today, and of course we're going to review the quiz results from the past week. I'm going to remind you again, guys, about the quizzes. When you leave a comment, please don't comment on the quizzes that say, things that might be the answers. And I know most people are just going to read it and then look at the comments, but just in case, please don't say the answer or anything that alludes to the answer in the comments. And certainly don't make posts on the community page that give away the answer. That could be a problem for somebody who sees that first, because if you guys get what I'm saying, right? You guys understand. But anyway, I'm just asking, please don't do that. But the quizzes have been a lot of fun. We only have 6 this time instead of 7. We'll talk about that at the end of the video when I do the quiz review, because one of them, it was like that book, The Comedy of Errors. I'll talk about it later. But anyway, we've got a lot to talk about, and we have 10 questions, we have our quiz review, and of course we have a reading. So I'm going to read from this massive tome here, which this is actually the first 5 volumes of the history of Middle-earth. So this massive tome contains the Book of Lost Tales Part 1, the Book of Lost Tales Part 2, the Lays of Beleriand, the Shaping of Middle-earth, and the Lost Road and other writings. And of course I have the other 2. They're not quite visible here. I'd have to kind of, and they're not quite, I don't want to really, they're very heavy and they're in a box, but I recently got a nice physical manifestation of these books in 3 gigantic volumes, and I got a good deal for it. Previously I had them, electronically, which works for me when I'm doing research, to have all of Tolkien's books electronically. That's, when I'm reading for my own benefit, or I'm reading for your benefit, I like to have a physical book in my hand. But when I'm doing research, I prefer it all to be digital, so that way I can quickly search and scan and find the specific word or phrase that I'm looking for that will get me there very quickly, instead of, having to flip through pages. Of course, these come with bookmarks, and I've already bookmarked the part that I'm going to write. So we're going to read from the Book of Lost Tales Part 1, specifically Chapter 4, which is called The Chaining of Melko. And you might be familiar with the chapter in the Silmarillion called The Chaining of Melkor. Of course, if you take away the R in Melkor, you're wound up with Melko, which was actually his original name. They were going to, Tolkien was going to call him Melko at first, and he later changed it because he was changing the linguistics over time. There were a few other characters that had, early names that got changed. Some of them sort of stayed in one form or another, like Lúthien being Leithian in the early stage, while some were just differently spelled or slightly differently pronounced. Anyway, this starts with a note from Christopher Tolkien, which explains, and then we're going to go on to the actual text here. Following the end of Rúmel's tale of the coming of the Valar and the building of Valinor, there was a long interlude before the next one, though the manuscript continues without even interrupting the paragraph. But on the cover of the notebook, The Chaining of Melko is given as a separate title, and I have adopted this. The text continues in ink over an erased pencil manuscript. That night Ariel heard again in his sleep the music that had so moved him on his first night. And the next morning he went again into the gardens early. There he met Vaera, and she called him Ariel. That was the first making and uttering of that name. Ariel told Vaera of the dream musics he had heard, and she said that it was no dream music, but rather the flute of Timpinin, whom the gnomes Rumel and Little Heart and the others of my house call Tinfang. She told him that the children called him Tinfang Warble, and that he played and danced in summer dusks for the joy of the first stars. At every note a new one sparkles forth and glisters. The Noldoli say that they come out too soon if Tinfang Warble plays, and they love him, and the children will watch often from the windows, lest he tread the shadowy lawns unseen. She told Ariel that he was shyer than a fawn, swift to hide and dart away as any vole, a footstep on a twig, and he is away, and his fluting will come mocking from afar. And a marvel of wizardry liveth in that fluting, said Ariel, if that it be indeed, which I have heard now for 2 nights here. There be none, said Vaera, not even of the Solisimpi, who can rival him therein, albeit those same pipers claim him as their kin. Yet 'tis said everywhere that this quaint spirit is neither wholly of the Valar nor of the Eldar, but is half a fey in the woods and dells, one of the great companies of the children of Pelurian, and half a gnome or a shoreland piper. Howso that be, he is a wondrous wise and strange creature, and he fared hither away with the Eldar long ago, marching, not resting among them, but going always, heading, piping, strangely or whiles sitting aloof. Now he does play about the gardens of the land, but Alal Menora he loves the best, and this garden best of all. Ever and again we miss his piping for long months, and we say Tinfang Warble has gone heart-breaking in the great lands, and many a one in those far regions will hear his piping in the dusk outside tonight. But on a sudden will his flute be heard again at the hour of gentle gloaming, or will he play beneath a goodly moon and the stars go bright and blue? Aye, said Ariel, and the hearts of those that hear him go beating with a quickened longing. Meseemed 'twas my desire to open the window and leap forth, so sweet was the air that came to me from without, nor might I drink deep enough. But as I listened I wished to follow, I know not whom, I know not whither, out into the magic of the world beneath the stars. Then of a sooth 'twas Timpinin who played to you, said Vaera, and honoured are you, for this garden has not yet been empty of his melody many a night. Now, however, for such is the eeriness of that sprite, you will ever love the evenings of summer and the nights of stars, and the magic will cause your heart to ache unquenchably. But have you not all heard him many times and often that dwell there, said Ariel, yet do not seem to me like those who live with a longing that is half understood and may not be fulfilled? Nor do we, for we have Limpe, said she, Limpe that alone can cure, and a draught of it giveth a heart to fathom all music and song. Then said Ariel, would I might drain a goblet of that good drink, but Vaera told him that that might only be sought out Merrill the Queen. Of this converse of Ariel and Vaera upon the lawn that fair day-tide came it that Ariel set out not many days thereafter, and Tinfang Warble had played to him many times by dusk, by starry light and moon gleam, till his heart was full. In that was Little Heart his guide, and he sought the dwellings of Merrill Turinquie in her corn of elms. Now the house of that fair lady was in that very city, for at the foot of the great tower which Ingle had built was a wide grove of the most ancient and beautiful elms that all the land of elms possessed. High to heaven they rose, in 3 lessening stories of bright foliage, and the sunlight that filtered through was very cool, a golden green. Amidst of these was a great green sward of grass, smooth as a web of stuffs, and about it those trees stood in a circle, so that shades were heavy at its edge, But the gaze of the sun fell in all days on its middle. There stood a beautiful house, and it was builded all of white, and of a whiteness that shone. But its roof was so overgrown with moss and with house leek that many curious clinging plants, that of which was once fashioned, might not be seen for the glorious maze of colours, golds and red russets, scarlets and greens. Innumerable birds chattered in its eaves, and some sang upon the housetops, while doves and pigeons circled in flights about the corons' borders, or swooped to settle with sun upon the sward. Now all that dwelling was footed in flowers. Blossomy clusters were about it, ropes and tangles, spikes and tassels, all in bloom, flowers and panicles and umbels, or with great wide faces gazing at the sun. There did they loose upon the faintly stirring airs that several odors blended to a great fragrance of exceedingly marvelous enchantment, but their hues and colors were scattered and gathered seemingly as chance, and the happiness of their growth directed them. All day long there was a hum of bees among these flowers. Bees fared about the roof and all the scented beds and ways, even about the cool porches of the house. Now Little Heart and Ariel climbed the hill, and it was late afternoon, and the sun shone brazen upon the western sign of Ingil's tower. Soon came they to a mighty wall of hewn stone blocks, and this leaned outward, but grasses grew atop of it, and harebells, and yellow daisies. A wicket they found in the wall, and beyond was a glade beneath the elms, and there ran a pathway bordered of one side with bushes, while of the other flowed a little running water whispering over a brown bed of leafy mould. This led even to the sward's edge, and coming thither, said Little Heart, pointing to that white house, "Behold the dwelling of merrily Turinqui. As I have no errand with so great a lady, I will get me back again." Then Ariel went over the sunny lawn alone, until he was nigh shoulder high in the tall flowers that grew before the porches of the door. And as he drew near, a sound of music came to him, and a fair lady amid many maidens stepped forth, as it were, to meet him. Then she said, smiling, "Welcome, O mariner of many seas. Wherefore do you seek the pleasures of my quiet gardens and their gentle noise, when the salt breezes of the sea and the stuff of winds in a swaying boat should rather be your joy?" For a while Ariel might say naught thereto, being tongue-tied by the beauty of that lady and the loveliness of that place of flowers. Yet at length he muttered that he had known sea enough, but of this most gracious land he might never be sated. "Nay," said she, "on a day of autumn will come the winds, and a driven gull, maybe, will wail overhead, and lo, you will be filled with desire, remembering the black coasts of your home." "Nay, lady," said Ariel, and now he spoke with eager voice, "nay, not so. For the spirit that flutes upon the twilit lawns has filled my heart with music, and I thirst for a draught of Limpe." Then straightway did the smiling face of Merrill grow grave, and bidding her maidens depart, she prayed Ariel follow her to a space nigh to the house. And this was of cool grass, but not very short. Fruit trees grew there, and about the roots of one, an apple tree of great girth and age. The soil was piled so that there was now a broad seat around its bole, soft and grass-covered. There sat Merrill, and she gazed upon Ariel and said, "Know you then what it is you ask?" And he said, "I know naught, save that I desire to know the soul of every song, and of all music, and to dwell always in fellowship and kinship, and this wondrous people of the Eldar of the Isle, and to be free of unquenchable longing, even till the faring forth, even till the great end." But Merrill said, "Fellowship is possible maybe, but kinship not so, for man is man, and Elda. And what Ilúvatar has made unalike may not become alike while the world remains. Even didst thou dwell here till the great end, and for the health of Limpe found no death, yet then thou must die and leave us, for man must die once. And hearken, O Ariel, think not to escape unquenchable longing with a draught of Limpe, for only wouldst thou thus exchange desires, replacing thy old ones with new and deeper and more keen. Desire unsatisfied dwells in the hearts of both those races that are called the children of Ilúvatar, but with the Eldar most, for their hearts are filled with a vision of beauty in great glory. Yet, O Queen, said Ariel thereto, let me but taste of this drink, and become an age-long fellow of your people, O Queen of the Eldalia. that I may be as happy, children of Mar Vanwa Tjalieva. Nay, not yet can I do that, said Merrill, for 'tis a graver matter far to give this drink to one who has known life, and days already in the lands of men, than for a child to drink, who knows but little else. Yet even did these we keep long while, ere we gave them the wine of song, teaching them first much lore, and testing their hearts and souls. Therefore I bid you now, bide still longer, and learn all you may in this our isle. Lo, what do you know of the world, or of the ancient days of men, or of the roots which these things are now, or have far back in time? Or what of the Adalia and all their wisdom, should you claim our cup of youth and our poesy? The tongue of Tol Eressëa do I know, and of the Valar have I heard, and the great world's beginning and the building of Alinor. To musics have I hearkened, and to poesy and the laughter of the elves. And all I have found true and good, and my heart knows. And it is saith to me that these I always henceforth love, and love alone. Thus answered Ariel, and his heart was sore for the refusal of the queen. Okay, that's quite a bit there. So, what's interesting about this is, as I pointed out, this is called the Chaining of Melko, and I read quite a bit there, and you notice that Melko isn't even mentioned here, you know? And that really goes into how very detailed and evenly paced the Book of Lost Tales is, which really the Book of Lost Tales is a very old version of the Silmarillion. And the Silmarillion that we have, it's a collection of many different drafts, because he never really finished a full Silmarillion from beginning to end, the closest of which would be the Book of Lost Tales, because it covers, you know, most of the great tales there. There is a version of the fall of Gondolin, for example, what he referred to later as the primitive fall of Gondolin. But the writing style is very different in the Silmarillion, because what we have is an unfinished outline. And when Tolkien described it in one of his letters, I believe it was 131 or 151, I forget which of those it is. I think it's 131. It was the one where he was writing to a prospective publisher who he wanted to publish not just The Lord of the Rings, but sort of a trilogy of works, with the first part being The Lord of the Rings, and the last part, well, the first part really being the Silmarillion, and the last part being The Lord of the Rings, with the middle part being the Rings of Power. And what we know is the Rings of Power eventually just became, you know, the final chapter of the Silmarillion, of the Rings of Power and the Third Age, which even, you know, he had once thought to maybe put that simply as part of the Lord of the Rings. He wasn't sure what to do with that. You know, and it became, you know, after his death, when Christopher was editing everything together, it became the last part of the Silmarillion. But if you read the Silmarillion, there's some very beautiful prose in there. It's a wonderful book, very satisfying read if you can really just get it down, but it's very fast-paced. It goes through things very quickly. It's like, and then this happened, and then this happened, and then this happened, and there's very little in times of like pausing and just having dialogue. There are, of course, moments of that, but it's not a whole lot, especially when we compare it to works like The Lord of the Rings or The Hobbit, you know. So what we see here is like a really old version of the Silmarillion with a lot of characters that are unfamiliar to us. And of course, we get characters that are familiar. You know, they do, of course, mention Iluvatar and Valyra, and you know, like, of course, Melko is Melkor, you know, and Manwë's in that chapter as well. But you're getting, like, you know, a lot of this interesting stuff where there's these characters that are doing things and spending a lot of time talking and a lot of time describing the scenery, which was Tolkien's really, like, his strong point in writing, really. And that's, you know, when you read The Lord of the Rings, you're reading a lot of descriptions of scenery. He doesn't even describe his characters all that well, and he does this on purpose because he wants everybody to sort of just know a sense of what the character looks like, and then, you know, just sort of fill in the blanks. Like for to pick a character from The Lord of the Rings is Faramir. What do we know about what Faramir looks like? We know he has black hair, and the fact that he has black hair is mentioned, you know, far after we actually meet him. It's, you know, towards the end of the book, you know, so it's really interesting that a lot of times his characters aren't described. We don't know what Legolas looks like, for example. We don't really know what Frodo looks like, for example. So there's a lot of these sort of things. Even when he's describing a woman, it's usually just telling you how beautiful she is, and sometimes the manner of dress that she wears, and the color of her hair. I mean, that's really all we get about Galadriel. We get that she has golden hair, and that she's very beautiful, and that she wears a simple white dress, and that's really it. And then she has a ring that most people can't see, but Frodo can. So there's a lot of description that you see in the Book of Lost Tales that you don't see in the Silmarillion, because it really is an outline. So anyway. We have a lot to get through today. We have 10 questions, and then we have the quiz review at the end. So we're going to get started here. I could talk about, the chanting of Melko and everything. And of course, one day we're going to read all of this, on a stream, and there'll be videos up where I'm analyzing everything. Like we did that with The Hobbit, and we did that with the Fellowship of the Ring, and we're in the midst of doing that with the Two Towers. And of course, we'll do the Return of the King, and we'll do the Silmarillion, and we'll do Unfinished Tales, and we're going to do a lot of different things over the many, many months to come. And at one point, yes, we will want to go through the Book of Lost Tales and all the other books in this set. But anyway, let's get started with your first question. Is what I would say, except I just realized that I didn't tell you how to submit questions. I usually do that at the beginning of the video, but I forgot this time. So here I am editing this part in so that it's here. So if you want to ask a question, you can of course just ask a question right there in the comments section, and I'll answer you in the comments section. But if you want your question to be, considered for a video, there's two ways to go about this. One way is by going through Quora, which is a knowledge sharing platform where you could ask any sort of question and have people with relevant knowledge or wisdom or experience or expertise answer your question. And if you ask any sort of question on the Quora about the works of J.R.R. Tolkien, you're going to get a list of names of people that you can tag, and you just find me on that list. I'll be at or near the top of the list, and you can submit it that way. Or easier than that, there's a link right to my Quora account in the description of this video, as well as a link to my Quora space, the Grey Havens, where you can see all of my writing, as well as the writing of several other Tolkien writers that are very good. And if you don't want to use Quora, you can do it here on YouTube through the Community tab. Now, unfortunately, this feature only seems to be available on the YouTube mobile app, but all you have to do on the mobile app is go to my channel and then click Join the Community, and you can make a post there. Just make sure that you know that if I'm going to answer it, it will be in a video. Sometimes I may sit on a question for a while. Don't get discouraged. Anyway, guys, now let's get to your first question. Our first question comes in by the request of Frankie Dog K, who asks, I was thinking recently about Thorin's harp. Did it have any history? What about the harp that Elrond brings to the Grey Havens? Was it the harp of Tur? Also, while musing on musical artifacts, I wonder, is there any info given to the history of the silver horn that Elrohir brings to Aragorn that seems to rouse the dead army? So some interesting questions here. Unfortunately, the answers are probably not going to be as interesting as you're hoping here. Let's start with Thorin's harp and the instruments in general that in The Hobbit that the dwarves bring to Bilbo's house. There really isn't any particular history or any really good significance to the instruments of the dwarves, other than the simple fact that they each carry differing instruments, and that you could possibly, if you want to, make some sort of inference on what their individual personality might be based on what instrument they play. And this, I think it's especially true for Thorin Oakenshield, because he makes Dwalin and Balin retrieve his harp from the porch, in addition to the fact that they had to carry their instruments, which are described as viols, that are as large as they are. So Thorin, he's important, he's self-important, and that's what I would take from that scene, that he plays a very large, heavy, and delicate instrument, and that he makes others carry it for him. Moving on to the harp that Elrond carried, it could not possibly be his grandfather Tur's harp. But I think it was likely an allusion to it, that he's a harpist like his grandfather was. Tur is described as a harpist in every version of The Fall of Gondolin. And while the final version that Tolkien was writing, which you could read, in a few different places, I first read it in Unfinished Tales, where it was the very first chapter of the book, where it was called Of Tur and His Coming to Gondolin. In that version didn't include a description of his harp, but it was unfinished. But every version that did describe Tur's harp described it as being made out of wood, and the strings were the sinews of bears. Elrond's harp is silver, so it can't be the same one, and I would say that it's likely that if Tur's harp survived the fall of Gondolin, then he would have taken it to the west with him. There isn't any specific history as well to the silver horn that Aragorn received from Elro here, other than that it was probably just a really good war horn. War horns especially, they're very important, just in general, starting with the Valaroma all the way down to the horns of, Rohan and Gondor. Silver horns come up a few times, in the Lord of the Rings. There's that mention, and there's also a mention that Prince Imrahil's men had harps, and they had horns of silver. And then later, Éowyn actually gives Merry a horn. It's not mentioned what it's made out of when she gives it to him, but when he blows it in the Shire, it's mentioned to be a silver horn. Aragorn's horn rousing the dead army, though, that really shouldn't come as a surprise. The greatest of war horns can have some pretty amazing effects. Look at the terror that the horn of Helm Hammerhand struck into the forces of Saruman, and the fact that the great horn of Gondor, blown by Boromir, actually made the Balrog Durin's Bane just sort of pause for a moment. And if you know how powerful a Balrog is, that's really saying something, that a man with a horn could make it stop for even a moment. The forces of evil tend to be afraid of war horns, and which is why the forces of good use them. It's likely why the Uruk-hai went out of their way to specifically cut Boromir's horn in half. It was now useless. Nobody could ever use it again. This goes all the way back to Melkor cowering before the mighty horn blasts of Oroma and the laughter of Tulkas. So there's great history to horns in general, just not to those specific ones. All right, let's move on to the next question. Our next question comes in by the request of Massive Slander Edits, who asks, was the storm at the beginning of the Battle of the Five Armies sent by Sauron, and was the wind that scattered it sent by Manwë? So there wasn't actually a storm at the Battle of Five Armies, and Sauron was not involved in this battle in any way, shape, or form. It is possible that Manwë had some involvement, however. We'll come back to that. The storm is used really just as a metaphor leading up to the Battle of Five Armies, and the sky would have appeared stormy during the battle, but it wasn't caused by weather. The metaphorical storm is mostly told through the chapter titles. There's a chapter, The Gathering of the Clouds, which involves all of the players getting into their places and the mounting tensions between the dwarves and the elves and the men. A storm is brewing, not a literal storm. And then there's The Clouds Burst, which is the outbreak of violence. And just as it comes to blows, Gandalf announces that the goblins and the wargs have arrived, and the dwarves put aside their differences with the men and the elves, and they all fight together. There is a reference in The Hobbit to the stormy sky, but it's not literal weather. Goblins, that is to say orcs, cannot easily travel and fight during the day. So this battle takes place during the day. In The Lord of the Rings, Saruman got around this by breeding orcs that could withstand the sunlight, and Sauron got around it by just casting darkness over the sky. In this instance, in The Hobbit, the Battle of Five Armies, we're seeing something you don't see very often, the example of goblin magic, because the army of goblins and wargs was preceded by a vast swarm of bats in the sky to blot out the sun so that they could travel and fight. Sauron had no part in the battle. He had been driven out of Mirkwood by the White Council, and he was on his way down to Mordor to establish himself there. He didn't really care about Erebor. Gandalf's concern leading up to all this was more that Smaug, the dragon, might be compelled to or enticed to assist Sauron. And while Sauron coming to Smaug's aid might be a way to press the dragon into his service, it's at the Battle of Five Armies we're talking about. The dragon's already dead. Sauron's, run down to Mordor. His tower has been rebuilt, and he's ready to take his throne. The involvement of Manwë is sort of up in the air. I think this is one of those things that we could say is open to interpretation. We did get the saving grace of the great eagles, which Tolkien also referred to as the birds of heaven, in the final stage of the battle, which, along with Beorn killing Bolg, the head goblin, turned the tide of battle for the better. When Tolkien first conceived The Hobbit, he did not imagine to include it in the shared universe that he had created with his previously written stories, like The Fall of Gondolin and The Children of Húrin and all of the early Silmarillion writings that would comprise the Book of Lost Tales, which we read a little bit from earlier. But he did put an awful lot of references to those works in his writing of The Hobbit. Bilbo talks about the migration of the three kinds of high elves, and in the very earliest drafts, the necromancer was more explicitly Sauron, who at that point was actually called Thu. And of course, Elrond is in The Hobbit, but these were just fun things that he was throwing into what he considered to be this standalone children's tale. It wasn't until he started penning the sequel, The Lord of the Rings, that he decided, that's all going to be part of one whole. So that being said, the eagles may have shown up simply because they wanted to. They certainly hated orcs, or it could have been just a little bit of a nudge from Manwë. Certainly nobody but Manwë could have sent them to the Black Gate at the end of The Lord of the Rings, and had Gwaihir be so willing to carry Gandalf wherever he wanted to go, even if he was made out of stone. So the eagles do sometimes get orders from Manwë. We just don't really know if the Battle of Five Armies is one of those cases. I think it is. That's my opinion. Bilbo is meant to find the One Ring, so certainly his survival and his safe passage home would have to be attended to. All right, let's move on to the next question. Our next question comes in by the request of, we'll just call him Adak, because that's what he's called on my Discord. In The Hobbit, it states that Bilbo's relation to Belladonna Took had fairy blood. Does this mean that Bilbo was related to elves in any way? No, the book didn't say that. You have to be very careful when you craft a question, because especially if you post it on Quora, which is where this was posted, because a lot of people don't read the answers. If you write something on Quora or even on YouTube like this, some people they'll take it as a fact, and maybe they'll wonder why, and they'll read the answer or they'll watch the video in that case, but maybe they won't, and now you've put it into people's heads that The Hobbit states that Belladonna Took had fairy blood, and then I'm obligated to answer just to clear up the fact that no, it didn't say that. Now, it is true that you drew a very, very correct conclusion here, though, that fairy refers to elves in this instance here, in the way that some hobbits of the Shire may not believe that elves actually exist. They're just characters from fairy stories, so they are fairies themselves. The book doesn't state that Belladonna Took has fairy blood in her. This is what it says. It was often said in other families that long ago one of the Took ancestors must have taken a fairy wife. That was, of course, absurd. But certainly there was still something not entirely hobbit-like about them, and once in a while members of the Took clan would go and have adventures. It was once said is like going around saying, many people say, a lot of people say, and then you just sort of let people infer that what you're saying is a fact. Of course, I didn't say that that's a fact, only, that a lot of people are saying something. But unfortunately, too many people in the world think that if enough people think something, then it just must be true. What we have here is an unsubstantiated rumor. The Tooks themselves aren't claiming to have any fairy blood. It was other families that said this at some point in the past. One of their ancestors must have married a fairy. Belladonna isn't specifically mentioned, although that is, that's Bilbo's mother. The text goes on to just say, well, that's absurd, and it explains why such a rumor exists, that the Tooks are seen as not entirely hobbit-like, at least by the standards of the Shire. In this particular point in time, they're seen as strange. The other families have, their standards of what a hobbit is and how a hobbit must act, and if someone acts in a way that is deviant or contrary, they're accused of not being wholly hobbit. Tolkien used a similar trick in the primitive version of The Fall of Gondolin, and we just talked about this, I think, last week, where Meglin, which is the old name of Maeglin, is described as being less lovely than the other elves, and he has a, sort of a foul temperament, and so the other elves started spreading a rumor that he's got some orc blood in him, and Tolkien even sort of does the same trick in writing in The Fall of Gondolin, where he says, in the narration, that this is ridiculous. And remember, just because a character in a book says something doesn't mean that the book is saying that this is a fact. Characters can be wrong. Characters can lie. And in this case, all we have is a rumor about the Tooks that ignorant hobbits use to explain why that particular family doesn't conform to their standards of what hobbits should be. All right, let's move on to the next question. Our next question comes in by the request of Costa Zilakakis, who asks, could the song Gildor and Glorian used to deter away the Nazgûl been an indication of high Ñoldor nobility? Could it have been a song of power, not unlike what Finrod used to battle Sauron himself? So I don't actually believe that the song that Gildor and his company sang was specifically to deter Nazgûl, though I think it did deter the Nazgûl. I don't think they were singing with that particular intention. I just think that their arrival was very fortuitous for Frodo and Sam and Pippin. Frodo noticed that the elves, were there, and he noticed pretty soon that there were elves right after one of the Nazgûl has just sort of slunk off, and he figured out very quickly that they were high elves by the fact that they were singing about Elbereth, which is the Sindra name for Varda. Later, when he invoked the names of Elbereth and Lúthien, it is said to be anathema to the wraiths. Aragorn says that it was painful for them to hear those names, and the second time Frodo tried it, the Witch King used a spell to make Frodo stop talking. As for Gildor being nobility, there's no question of that. He's nobility, if not outright royalty. And we know this because of the way he introduced himself. He said he was Gildor in Glorian of the House of Finrod. Now, it gets a little complicated, and I don't think I really need to go into all the complexities of Tolkien changing names and everything, because it's a lot to sort of keep together with a lot of very similar sounding names. Finrod is the son of Finarfin, and he's one of Galadriel's three brothers. But at the same time, that Tolkien was writing this, he might have not been referring to that character, Finrod Felagund. He might have actually been referring to Fingon, who was called Finrod at one point in the earlier drafts. Fingon was a high king of the Ñoldor. He was Finrod's cousin. So they're both descended from Finwë, the Ñoldor king in the Undying Lands, at least until he died and decided to stay in Mandos when his son Finarfin became the king. In Middle-earth, it was going to look like Feanor was probably going to be the king there of the Ñoldor, but he was Finwë's eldest son. But he didn't last very long. He died before he could actually establish a kingdom, and he would never be let out of Mandos. So his half-brother Fingolfin became the first High King. So whether he's related directly to Finrod or Fingon is immaterial. Of course, they are cousins, so if you're related to one, you're related to both of them. Gildor is a relative of some sort to both characters, and this would make him either royalty, yet not in line to rule anything, or nobility. We know so little about Gildor. There's really not a lot about this character at all. He's not in the Silmarillion. So we don't know by what fashion he is related to Finrod. But he is of his house, whichever Finrod we're talking about. There's Finrod, Felagund, and then there's Finrod, who is Fingon. And at one point, Finrod that we know was Inglor, and that's sort of where Gildor Inglorian comes from. So it's a whole confusing thing. But the fact that he refers to himself and his group as exiles who are tarrying before returning home, that suggests that he likely was born in the First Age, and that he probably came over the Helcaraxa with the likes of Fingolfin and Turgon and Galadriel and several other very important characters. These exiles were forgiven, with the exception of Galadriel, and allowed to return home after the War of Wrath, but it was mentioned that some of them chose to tarry in Middle-earth for a while. It's been like 6,000 years, but to an elf, that's a while. Gildor does sail to the west with Galadriel and Elrond and Gandalf at the end of the tale, but that's all we know about him. So there you have it. All right, let's get into the next question. So this question came in from Link of Wise. How does Middle-earth have the likes of tomatoes and other plants native to the New World, such as potatoes and pipeweed, if it is more meant to be Europe in an ancient past? I knew this one was going to come up eventually. Let me highlight the absurdity here, because this question has been around, and this is sort of like one of those that will never truly go away. Why didn't they just ride the eagles to Mordor? That sort of question. Let me give you a list of things that some people, I should say, will not accept existed in Middle-earth due to the fact that it's Europe in the past. Tomatoes, potatoes, and tobacco. Now I'm going to give you a list of things that people will accept existed in Middle-earth, which they will also remind you as often as possible is Europe in the past. Dragons, angels, hobbits, elves, dwarves, orcs, lembasbred, Miravor, the Palantiri, Silmarils, vampires, werewolves, wargs, giant talking eagles who may also be angels, spiders the size of Volkswagen Beetles, trolls, and Tom Bombadil. And this is not an exhaustive list, but surely my point has been made. Middle-earth is not a historical Europe. It is a mythological landmass that is roughly analogous to Europe, Africa, and Asia altogether. The key word is mythological. Tomatoes are also not mentioned in the main four works: The Hobbit, The Lord of the Rings, The Silmarillion, and Unfinished Tales. All 12 volumes of the history of Middle-earth, the nature of Middle-earth, and Tolkien's letters also don't mention tomatoes. Now, it's true that there was once a reference to tomatoes in an early draft of The Hobbit, which was later changed to pickles. Some have thought that Tolkien changed this because, it's a New World plant and it doesn't belong in Middle-earth. But here's something wild. The phrase Middle-earth doesn't appear in The Hobbit. It's referred to only as the wide world. The fact is, when Tolkien wrote The Hobbit, and I alluded to this earlier, references to Middle-earth existed, like Elrond and Gondolin, but he was not meaning for it to be in the same mythology, at least not until he started writing The Lord of the Rings. The tomato reference can only be found in the book Mr. Baggins, being the first part of the history of The Hobbit, which was edited by and with notes by a Tolkien scholar named John D. Rateliff. Now, Rateliff's opinion, which I very much agree with, is that Tolkien probably changed tomatoes to pickles in the story, not because tomatoes didn't exist in Bilbo's world, but because they were not yet in season at the time that the story was taking place, but pickles, being preserved and stored, could be enjoyed at any point in the year. Tobacco, let's go to that one. It's easily explained. It's explained right there in The Lord of the Rings. It's not indigenous to Middle-earth. It was from Númenor. It was brought over by the Dunedain as a form of potpourri. They were just enjoying it because they liked the way that it smelled. And eventually there was a hobbit named Tobold Hornblower who created the first strain of what they called Westmen's weed at the time, and it became the first true pipe weed, with affection being called Old Toby by the hobbits. Merry was going to go into the whole history of it, and it was right about there that Gandalf stopped him and said, listen, to Theoden, this guy, he'll talk your ear off about this stuff all day and all night, maybe we should stop now. Because we've got, bigger things to do. Then we get potatoes. Potatoes are kind of easy to explain if we use our imaginations a little bit. And that's really the point of reading fantasy literature. We could apply the same exact explanation for tobacco that we do to potatoes. They came from Númenor. If we wish to do that, because potatoes, wherever they exist, they'd wind up being a staple food, and it would make sense that Elendil would have plenty of taters on his ships, and since all you have to do to grow potatoes is just take a piece of one, cut it off, and bury it, and then just sort of let nature take its course, they would spread rather quickly. Or if we want to be slightly more inventive, and this is the way that I prefer it, and we could lean into the conceit of the author, that Tolkien did not, in fact, write these stories, but rather translated them. Or rather that there are two J.R.R. Tolkiens. There's the author, who wrote all these stories, and then there's J.R.R. Tolkien, who is a character in these stories, who is the one that translated them, So Tolkien as translator would, be translating the book, the big book that Elfwine brought him from the Undying Lands, and he would come across a word in the Westron language that refers to some sort of root vegetable that existed in Middle-earth at the time, and he just decided to translate it as potato so that people would just understand the story. They would understand that it's some sort of root vegetable that's used as a staple food. Much like, in The Hobbit, a pine tree is referred to as a Christmas tree. It's possible that, what Bilbo actually would have written there would be Yuletide tree, because in, the Hobbits celebrate a festival in the winter called Yule. But as, Christmas is more well-known in modern England, the word would be translated as Christmas. So that's, another way that we could explain that away. All right, let's move on to the next question. Our next question comes in from Ollie McNicholas, and this is another one, just like the previous one, that's one of those questions that just turns up like a bad penny. It comes through every now and then, and every once in a while I'll take a stab at it to sort of like stem the tide a bit, but it always returns, How does The Lord of the Rings account for the fact that thousands of years pass without technological advancement? 3,000 years elapses between Sauron losing the ring and Frodo acquiring it, and yet Middle-earth seems unchanged. I could go into a lot of different things here. I could say, well, you say it seems unchanged, but it actually isn't. I could, bring up a lot of things about magic, and because technology is birthed out of need, and when you have magic, you don't need technology as much, and I can make a lot of different arguments. And in fact, there were, a lot of other people who took a stab at this question in the past and will take stabs at this question in the future. But I want to take a different approach this time. People think of the long millennia without major technological advancements in fantasy stories like The Lord of the Rings as unrealistic. And this is absurd for a few reasons. The first is that the genre is called fantasy. It's not meant to be realistic. I could go on about how magic exists and all that, but, instead I'm going to tell you that going thousands of years without very much of a change is realistic. So, the chart that I have here, you'll note that the technological advancement, at least up until the point where we are at, there's a part of it that is speculative for the future, it's exponential, meaning that the further along the timeline you go, the faster it advances. The opposite is also true. The further back in time you go, the slower the technological advancement is. Now, note that it only really starts to pick up right around when steam engines and vaccines were invented. Before that, there were thousands of years that would pass that would be more or less the same. Now, in The Lord of the Rings, they're not quite at the gunpowder stage of this chart, but they have fireworks, and Saruman has something that was very likely to be an early form of blasting powder. He was a wizard, and this wasn't something that was made available to the masses, who would assume that it's just magic and it's, beyond their reach. But I'm just saying that they're almost at the gunpowder stage, just not quite. Now, note that if you go earlier than the gunpowder stage in this chart, the main advancements are paper and windmills. Now, paper is mentioned a few times in The Hobbit and a whole bunch of times and in several different forms in The Lord of the Rings, but it's not mentioned at all in the Silmarillion. And note that windmills are never mentioned in any of Tolkien's works. Mills are mentioned twice in The Lord of the Rings, but they're likely to be water mills in the Shire. So technologically, The Lord of the Rings is somewhere after paper, but before windmills, and the Silmarillion is somewhere before paper. While the Silmarillion doesn't mention the wheel as a technological invention specifically, the word wheel is used several times as a metaphor and a description of movement. We can certainly believe that the dwarves would have had the wheel in Khazad-dûm. It would be an actual requirement to have the wheel technology to build something so massive underground. So let's make a very strong assumption that by the end of the First Age, they're after the wheel part of the chart. If you look at the chart, just the fact that the section that's labeled 1800 to now is about 5 times as tall as a previous section that represents 12,000 years. That says a lot. How much time is between the wheel and paper? About 3,000 years or so. Now, there actually were some times in Tolkien's world where technology started to advance and started to grow at a faster rate, but then something terrible would happen. The Akalabeth would come and wipe Númenor off the map, or something like that. Tolkien's world is very heavily post-calamity land that has had a lot of setbacks. But then again, so is our world. The fact is, technology doesn't start to move rapidly until big inventions like the steam engine, the printing press, and more recently electronic computers, which is only 80 years ago. These sorts of things speed things up, and as we are mortals who only exist in our own time, we may assume that the past was sort of like what it is. That, in your whatever amount of time you have to live, you see a certain amount of technological advancement. And if you were to go back in time 3,000 years, it would be like, whoa, they don't have anything. But if that person from 3,000 years ago went 3,000 years further back, there would be changes, but it wouldn't be as drastic. And the more of those jumps you do, the less of a big difference there would be. So there you have it. Let's move on to the next question. Here's another one from Aduk, who asks, are the animals in Middle-earth known to be more intelligent than in our own world? Yeah, it certainly seems like they are, especially that they can communicate with people who put in the effort to do so. There are a lot of indications in Tolkien's works to lead us to believe that animals in his world are a lot smarter than those in our world. In The Hobbit, we learn that birds can speak human language and that some people can speak bird languages. One of the birds even proves to be wiser than Thorin Oakenshield. The bird is willing to carry his messages, but tells him that he's making some pretty wrong decisions. Beorn has various animals in his house that, tend to the needs of his guests, sometimes without him even actually being there. Wargs speak in their own language that Gandalf can understand, and wearing the One Ring allows Bilbo to understand spiders, but more importantly, the spiders can understand the human speech that he's speaking to them. In The Lord of the Rings, there's a fox that pauses and has his thoughts on Frodo and Sam and Pippin sleeping by the side of the road. Saruman uses birds as spies, and we're told that Farmer Maggot gave very specific and explicit instructions to his dogs on what they could do to Frodo if he ever was caught stealing his mushrooms again. Of course, there's also Shadowfax, and Legolas is able to feel the emotions of horses. In The Fall of Gondolin, gulls and swans specifically lead Tuor to the shore for his meeting with Ulmo. Beren and Lúthien has Huan and all the things that, go with him. In his letters, Tolkien mentions that the animals in the Undying Lands are pretty similar to the ones in Middle-earth, but they are immortal there. There are also some very important animals that give us some insight into how this all happened. Tolkien changed his mind about the great eagles a few times, but he settled in the end that they were Maiar spirits that chose to inhabit animal forms, but it does seem that the Valar require their animals to be at a higher level, hence Huan being capable of speech, as he once belonged to Orome. Many of the intelligent animals that we find in the Third Age may be descended from animals that were owned by the Valar at one point. Shadowfax, who is the descendant of Eorl the Young's steed Felaroth. And then if we go further back, we may actually wind up all the way back at Nahar, who is Orome's horse. Or if not him, one like him. So there you have it. All right, let's move on to the next question. Our next question comes in by the request of Walter White, who asks, quote from a Tolkien letter, "They went as emissaries to distant regions, east and south, far out of Númenórean range, missionaries to enemy-occupied lands. What was this Númenórean range, and how far do the Númenórean people sail in Middle-earth?" So this is actually referring to the Blue Wizards. This was in his earlier estimation when he claimed to not know their names, but that they traveled to the enemy-occupied lands to the east and the south. He also states that he does not know how successful they were, but that they likely founded cults of magic that would persist after Sauron's fall. Now, in this case, the Númenórean range doesn't refer to how far they sailed. They sailed everywhere, pretty much. The Númenóreans were explorers at heart and were only forbidden to sail to the west. Every other direction was just fine. It was mentioned that they went all the way to the south and the north and so far to the east that they came to the edge of the world, as the world was a disk in those days. In this case, what Tolkien is referring to with Númenórean range is not really where they explored in their ships, but rather where they colonized and settled. They saw those places and possibly got out of their ships, and they met and they traded with various peoples in the far east. We certainly know this to be the case in the far south, as Tar Aldarion got a lot of wood for building ships from that region, but they did not settle there. They didn't make outposts, they didn't build dwellings, they didn't raise crops or declare any of those lands to be their own. So the Blue Wizards going out of the Númenórean range means that they were in places where there had been no men of the West, only men and possibly elves that were indigenous to Middle-earth. All right, let's move on to the next question. This next question comes in by the request of Daxton1, who asks, how sharp is Sting? When Bilbo gives Sting to Frodo in Rivendell, he demonstrates how sharp it is by casually inserting it into a wooden beam with virtually no effort. Are elvish weapons basically lightsabers? So, not all elvish weapons, some of them, we'll say. Personally, I've always wondered what Elrond thought about Bilbo thrusting his sword into wooden beams in his house. That being said, this scene demonstrates that the sword of Gondolin's, even the small daggers of Gondolin, because this was a dagger, it was a sword for somebody who was Bilbo's size, but these swords are just impossibly magically sharp. Thrusting a sword into wood is a few things. The first thing is it's difficult. It's very hard to do, but we're told that Bilbo, who at this point is very old, he does it with very little effort. Another thing is that once you get the sword into the wood, it's very difficult to pull it back out of the wood, and someone does pull it out of the wood. It's likely Frodo that does this, because just after Bilbo does his little party trick, the text simply says that Frodo accepts the sword. The last thing is that doing this is a fantastic way to damage the blade, and Sting comes out of this just fine. It's unscathed. This is not merely just a testament to the power of Sting and the craftsmanship of the Elves of Gondolin, but I think it's an allusion to the matter of Britain, specifically the Arthurian legends. There is, of course, no Arthurian canon, just Arthurian classics. So the stories can differ from each other and contradict each other all they want. You just decide which ones you like. But let's talk about Calyxvul, or that is to say, Excalibur. Calyxvul, or Excalibur, was said to be extracted from an anvil that sat on top of a stone, or in some versions it was embedded in the stone itself. As difficult and damaging to a blade as it is to thrust into wood, thrusting into an anvil, which would be made out of cast iron or cast steel, or a boulder, it's a lot worse, and it's really just impossible. In the case of Calyxvul, only the chosen true king can pull the sword from the anvil or the stone, and Arthur does it effortlessly, and in many versions he repeats the feat by thrusting the sword back in and out several times just to prove that he did it and that he's the king. Bilbo in this scene is the chosen, the ring finder, as he's referred to in the Silmarillion, passing his sword on to the chosen ring bearer. Essentially, he is ceding his importance in the tale to Frodo, and by extension Samwise, who's the one who actually used Sting to its greatest effect in The Lord of the Rings. This is done by one party putting the sword into the metaphorical anvil, which is a wooden beam, and the other person taking it out. Still, I just really wonder how annoyed Elrond got by the whole thing. I mean, I suppose Bilbo translating the Silmarillion made up for him damaging part of Elrond's house, because who knows how many times he did that. He probably carved his name into the beams and things like that. All right, let's move on to the last question. Our final question comes in from Time Lord Guy, who asks, in the original draft of Beren and Lúthien, there is a cat creature called Tevildo. Was there an actual monster like that in Angband in the service of Melkor? So, I'm a little confused by the question, but I can talk about Tevildo a bit. Tevildo was Melkor's pet cat, who was one of the primary antagonists. I would actually say the primary antagonist in the very early drafts of Beren and Lúthien. Later, the character of Tevildo was folded into a separate character named Thu the Necromancer, who is eventually renamed to Sauron. Whether or not there really was a Tevildo depends on how one chooses to interpret this question. If we're asking whether or not Tevildo was real in the context of a legendarium, no. These early drafts, compiled mostly in, the first 2 volumes of the Book of Lost Tales, and we keep coming back to the Book of Lost Tales, which is why I chose to read from it at the beginning of this video. They exist in universe as texts, which are corrupted versions of the tales of the First Age that are told by men. Men are mortal, and they have to pass tales down through a great many generations, and these tales tend to change over time because everybody puts their own flair and dramatics into it. So Melkor becomes Melko, and at some point Sauron becomes a monstrous cat, and before you know it, this is a story being told in Númenor and in Gondor. And of course, the Númenorians were quite aware that Sauron's not a cat. A lot of them met him face to face, and for some of them, he was the last thing they ever saw. But it was certainly a tale that was told as a parable or as a fairy story. As to whether there was a Tevildo in the story itself, well, if we accept the story as a perfectly legitimate version of Beren and Lúthien, we can assume that neither the primary characters are hallucinating a giant cat, so we can assume that he's real. Tevildo was likely born out of the fact that Tolkien didn't like cats, and he had a strong preference for dogs, so you get the heroic dog Huan and the evil cat Tevildo. There's a distinct possibility that Melkor might have kept perfectly ordinary cats in his palace, and that one could have been named Tevildo, and he was of an ordinary size, and he didn't speak. But that lies, kind of firmly in the realm of surmise. Tolkien took his mistrust of cats out in other ways. Sauron likened Shelob to being a stray cat that he takes care of. There was a nasty queen of Gondor named Beruthiel who sent cats out as her spies to learn gossip and secrets about people so that she could use it against them. Tolkien's story, Roverandom, was a story about a dog and a cat. The dog would go on adventures. He was Rover. And then there was this cat named Tinker who just didn't believe a word of any of the stories that Rover would tell him of his adventures. Tolkien himself once mentioned a fictional version of himself having a cat named Grimalkin, which is an allusion to Greymalkin, which was a demonic spirit in Macbeth that took the form of a cat, and as well as the word itself being a very ancient name for a cat. Tolkien was absolutely aware of the linguistic origins of cats. Tevildo also had the title Berthon Mialgion. Rather. And then he had a minion who was his cook, and she was named Miaula. The former, I'm going to say it, Brithon Mialgion, that means essentially Prince of Cats, and the second one, the latter, Miaula, is just she-cat. It might seem silly to say, the gnomish word for cat is meow, but there's a real-life analog here. One of the very oldest types of cats in the world is an Egyptian type of cat called a mao. It's almost like somebody, saw a cat for the very first time and was like, "Whoa, little guy, what are you?" And the cat went, "Meow." And I'm like, "Okay, yeah, that sounds fair enough. Okay, you told me your name. That's what you're called now." So, there you have it. So there is absolutely a reason why the gnomes, the elves in this case, would call cats meow. So there you have it. That was our last question, so you guys know what's going to happen now. Let's get to the quiz review. So let's get to our quiz results, and we'll of course talk about all the different answers and everything and go over them. What's really interesting here is that you might notice there are only 6 quizzes this week. There was one that I just wound up having to skip. The question was, which of the dwarves in The Hobbit was the first to arrive at Bilbo's house? And the choices that I gave were Balin, Dwalin, Dori, and Nori. And I thought, well, this is kind of an easy question, but somebody might not know it off the top of their head. And it was actually a question that somebody had asked me once during a stream, and I was like, I think I know it. And I was right, but I had to think about it for a second. So it's sort of an interesting question. The first, and the problem is that I was typing it up on my phone. I wasn't at my computer, and I had to put out a quiz that day, so I typed it up on my phone, and my phone, the first time I did it, it started to correct me on things that didn't need to be corrected. The first time I posted it, it changed the word dwarf to award, which is ridiculous. And then the second time, what did it do the second time? Oh, it changed bag end to bad end, and I could have left that, but the last time I left a typo in this case, an autocomplete or an autocorrect, but the last time I left a typo in one of the quizzes, there was this one guy who came after me something fierce, and I wound up having to block him because he was being, such a fool of a took, really. But I didn't want to go through that again, so I tried one more time, and I made sure everything is spelled right, and for some reason the app screwed up on me and incorrectly put Balin as the correct answer. It's Dwalin. So I was like, at this point, it's like halfway through the day and I'm frustrated, and let's just forget about it and, come back the next day. But let's get to the 6 quizzes that we did do. So here's the first one. What nickname did Tolkien give the first family car that he owned? And it was suggested to me by a good friend of mine to sometimes put in questions about Tolkien himself, and I thought, well, that's a good idea. So the answers that I gave her are Joe, Jerry, John, and Jenny, and it's pretty evenly split here. There isn't really a majority, but a very small plurality got it correct. It was Joe at 31%. Very close behind was Jenny. I kind of figured people would go for Jenny because it was a lady name, and a lot of people say their cars are women, although in this case J-O could be Josephine. It was Joe. It was actually, he called his car the Machine, but also he called it Joe because the first 2 characters of what they would call in the UK the number plate. In the United States we call it the license plate, were J and O. So he said, oh, there's Joe. And then later, he had to replace the car and he got a second car. And this one didn't have that number plate, but he still called it Joe 2, which is interesting. Tolkien was very bad at driving, by the way, and he wrote a delightful little children's story called Mr. Bliss, which is sort of based on his own adventures driving around the countryside, very poorly. All right, so here's the second one. Which of J.R.R. Tolkien's children tried to flush the old Tom doll down the toilet? Which is, of course, referring to the doll that was based off of, Tom Bombadil was based off of the doll, and it gave the choices of Christopher, Michael, John, and Priscilla. And I hate to say it here, but you guys really didn't get this one. The correct answer was John, and that was the least amount of you went for that at 16%. The plurality here was Christopher, and I think most people went to Christopher because he's so important in the Tolkien community. He was his father's editor. He was his father's literary executor. He helped draw a lot of the maps. He was very important. He was the first Tolkien critic and the first Tolkien scholar, but he had nothing to do with old Tom. The doll was actually owned by Michael, which is probably why 30% of people went for it, but it was John that thought the doll was creepy and wanted to get rid of him, so he attempted to flush him down the toilet, which his father thought was hilarious, and he started writing poems about, old Tom being this merry fellow, and and his bright blue his jacket is, and his boots are yellow, ring-a-ding-dillo. Moving on to the next one. Which of these languages did Tolkien not speak? Once again, close but no cigar. Most people went for Russian here. The choices were Latin, Afrikaans, Russian, or French. The correct answer is Afrikaans. 35% of you guys got that correct. I'm thankful only 7% went to Latin because he was very, very good at Latin. As a matter of fact, he translated part of the Jerusalem Bible. He was working on that shortly before. I guess a lot of that was in Hebrew as well, but he was very familiar with all the Latin prayers, and he learned Latin very young. He spoke Russian, he spoke French, he spoke so many other languages. Afrikaans is interesting because he was actually born in South Africa, which that's where they would speak Afrikaans. The reason that he was born in South Africa because his father had a job as a banker and he had to travel there for a while, so the Tolkiens lived there for a while. Tolkien was born there, but then him and his mother went back to the United Kingdom. He was only 3 years old, so he wouldn't have ever learned the language, and he never did speak it, despite some people on Quora being incredibly insistent that he must have spoken Afrikaans because there's some words in his languages that are similar to words in Afrikaans, but that's really because Afrikaans is so similar to Dutch, which is derived, it has a similar linguistic root that English has from Old Norse, so that's why there are some similar words. But that being said, unfortunately he never met his father again after he moved back to the UK because his father died died in South Africa. But there you have it. All right, here's the next one. Which real-life country did Tolkien refer to as Gondor? And I'm happy to say the majority of you, 58%, got this right. It was Italy. I also chose Finland, Portugal, and Switzerland, just to name some random countries. And what's really fun is if you take a map of Europe and you overlay it onto a map of Middle Earth, and you line up Oxford, which is Tolkien's home, with Hobbiton, which is Frodo's home, Bilbo's home, and you'll notice that as long as you get the scale correct, that there's a lot that makes a lot of sense. Suddenly, Mount Doom is a real volcano that's in, I believe it was in Croatia. Gondor is Italy. The Mirkwood Forest is the Black Forest. There's a lot of really good analogs there. It's not, of course, one-to-one. There's, France isn't even on the map. France is like jutting out into the water. But I digress. That's also Tolkien being a bit of an Englishman, so to speak. But let's move on to the next one. Which of these Hobbit names did I make up? I thought this one would be funny, and it was. Unfortunately, you guys didn't get this one. The answers here were Daddy Two-Foot, Bucka of the Marish, Chica Baggins, and Nindo Baggins. Nindo Baggins is completely made up. There was never a Nindo Baggins. I just made it up because it sounded sort of Hobbit-like. Only 17% of people got that. All the rest of these are real. Some of them are pretty obscure. The fun one is Daddy Two-Foot. I really just wanted to put him in a quiz here, and I got some pretty amazing comments on this quiz who were like, "Oh my God, Daddy Two-Foot," or "No way, that's a real Hobbit name." But what's interesting is he's actually one of the first few characters named in the Fellowship of the Ring. As a matter of fact, if I go to chapter 1 here, that's the prologue here. And, okay, so considering that chapter 1 starts on page 29, because there's a lot of introductory stuff here, and then we go to the second page of the first chapter, and here it is right here. But what about this Frodo that lives with him? Asked old Noakes of Bywater. Baggins is his name. But he's more than half a brandybuck, they say. It beats me why any Baggins of Hobbiton should go looking for a wife away in Buckland where folk are so queer. And no wonder they're queer, put in Daddy Two-Foot, the gaffer's next-door neighbour, if they live on the wrong side of the Brandywine River and ride agin the old forest. That's a dark, bad place if half the tales be true. And then the gaffer, who's actually Sam's father, Hamfast, actually calls him Dad because, that's his nickname. So yeah, there really is a Hobbit named Daddy Two-Foot. He's one of the first few characters to have a speaking line in The Lord of the Rings, but it just sounds ridiculous. And here is our final one. Which of these names belongs to only one character in Tolkien's works? And this one, I knew this was going to be tough. But here it is, and I'm glad to say, okay, well, the plurality here was with Lúthien, and I kind of thought you guys might go for that, although I'm a little surprised because I mentioned in the previous video, well, actually, I guess a lot of you aren't members and haven't seen the previous video when I put this quiz up, but I mentioned there are several Lúthiens. There's actually 6 separate Lúthiens. Of course, there's Lúthien of Beren and Lúthien, but there's also Elfwine, who was also called Lúthien. The land of England, where this version of Lúthien, Elfwine, brought the Red Book to Tolkien as translator. He also referred to as the land of Lúthien. One of the early Valar that we talked about, I think, last week, the scrapped Valar was named Lúthien. So, yeah, there's actually a bunch of Lúthiens. There's 6 of them. Legolas, there's 2 Legolases. There's one in The Fall of Gondolin. There's one in The Lord of the Rings. They are 2 separate characters. Our Legolas, the one from The Lord of the Rings, is a Sindar elf, whereas the other one is a Ñoldor elf who sailed to the west. And actually, when he sailed to the west, he changed his name to Lycolasa, which is the same exact name. He just, was going for a Quenya translation of it. because Legolas is, of course, a Sindarin name. Glorfindel is the correct answer. There was only one Glorfindel. I'm surprised that anybody answered Turgon, but at least it's only 10%. There were two Turgons. One was actually Denethor's grandfather. They mentioned Denethor being the son of Ecthelion. Ecthelion being another name from a First Age elf. Ecthelion was the son of Turgon. So there was a lot of the stewards, especially, were named after elves of the First Age, but there's only one Glorfindel, and trust me, I checked. I had to make sure. Now, what's interesting is that Glorfindel was a name that he used in The Fall of Gondolin, but then he used it in The Lord of the Rings, and then he sort of forgot, wait a minute, oh my god, that guy died in The Fall of Gondolin, and that's actually where the idea came from that elves can reincarnate. But anyway, that's all of our quizzes and all of our questions, and unfortunately the fun's over. So we've come to the end of the video, and this is where I ask you to subscribe. So hit the subscribe button, hit the bell, turn on notifications, hit the like button as well, share the video with your friends, leave me a comment, say hi, do all that stuff. Come by the streams if you'd like. I stream every day on Twitch, and I stream most Thursdays here on YouTube, and all the links that you need are in the description. And consider joining as a member. Membership really helps me out because it's an income stream aside from ads and whatnot. And when you're a member, you get some great perks such as seeing all of the videos at least a week early. Some of the videos much more in advance than that. And of course, you get a badge and some emotes, and you get to just help me out. And it's really cheap. It's only $5 a month. So let's drive those membership numbers up. I want to have lots of people with that cool icon of the Gandalf G rune on their names. Anyway, I will see you guys next week.